Mark Few gave plenty of Gonzaga updates during Hall of Fame weekend, including a big one on the status of Braden Huff's knee injury.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Join all the action at FanDuel.com to play daily dingers and make your free pick on who's hitting a home run this MLB season. Well, it was a great weekend to be a Zag. Mark Few inducted into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts over the weekend. And we're going to focus more on some of the stuff that Mark Few said, not necessarily during his speech, which was lovely. If you haven't checked it out, you can find it on YouTube, pretty much anywhere it is out there. But on some comments he made prior to the actual induction on Saturday, talking about all sorts of things. He talked about Braden Huff's knee injury. He talked about the new 5-5 eligibility and kind of the chaos of that over the last few weeks and why he doesn't have an issue with bringing in those 5-5 guys. He also talked about some of the frustrations with the NCAA regarding European eligibility and gives us a little insight into where the staff feels they're at with Izan Almanza and Nathan Sousa. So that is where we're going to focus the show today. We talked last week on a couple of shows about kind of Mark Few's legacy and getting into the Hall of Fame, and there was some lovely stuff over the weekend. John Calipari, Grant Hill, John Stockton all spoke glowingly about Mark Few prior to his induction. There was a great video shared on social media with like Dick Vitale and Jay Wright and Eric Spoelstra and Steve Kerr and others talking about Few. It was really nice to see all of this this energy and positivity towards Coach Few and just the tremendous, truly incalculable job that he has done as the head coach of Gonzaga. But wanted to focus today's show on some of the updates regarding this upcoming season, because I know that's what we're all focused on right now here in mid-August, the typically doldrums of the offseason, and yet we still have some roster spots in flux as we get closer and closer to the tip-off of the 26-27 season. Let's start with Braden Huff. Most of these questions were asked by Theo Lawson of the Spokesman Review, who was out in Springfield as part of the ceremony over the weekend. Specifically, this question about Braden Huff's health was asked by Theo, and this is what Mark Few had to say, quote, "We've been very, very, very conservative with him, especially this summer. There's no need for him to do that. He's in great shape and looks good." Few also confirmed that Braden Huff is at this point 100% healthy. There is no concern right now about the knee injury that Braden Huff suffered last season that cost him half of the year. That is great news. It's not entirely unsurprising news. I think we would have heard something, or we would feel more concerned if Braden Huff, if we had heard anything about it. But for Huff, like, he was getting close to being healthy towards the end of the season. I think it was a little bit of a smokescreen that Gonzaga was kind of making it seem as if he might return for the NCAA tournament. I don't know that it was ever all that likely that Braden Huff was going to return for the NCAA tournament, but considering the committee had admitted, like right around when Huff got hurt, they straight up admitted for Texas Tech in particular that they bumped them down a seed line because they weren't going to have JT Toppin. So why on earth would you admit that a player is guaranteed to be out unless you absolutely have to? So I think that's why the staff was like, oh, like Huff, maybe, but it was never a likely that Huff would play last season. But I do think that he was on the road to recovery to the point where going into an entire offseason, it seemed pretty unlikely that the injury would still present a problem unless he suffered some kind of if he got a setback or re-injured it or re-aggravated it, which is part of the reason the staff is playing it so safe with him. We haven't seen a ton of clips of practice. We haven't heard a ton about what's happening at practice. Gonzaga has barely had a full team capable of practicing. We have seen in a few of the clips posted on social media that Noah Holland and Nolan Hickman and Adam Miller at times have been practicing with the team, presumably so that they can do actual 5-on-5 work. But we also haven't seen a ton of Braden Huff, and I think that is by design. The staff is letting him sit out a lot and taking it very, as Few said, very, very, very conservative with him up to this point. And I think there's good and bad with that. Obviously, the risk of re-aggravating the injury, if there is any risk at all, which I'm not a doctor. I'm not his doctor, but the trainers certainly are checking in on him very regularly. If they think there is risk in pushing it too much, it's not worth it. It's not worth pushing him at all. Let him rest. Let him do minimal amount of work. If it's non-impact stuff, if it's swimming or riding an exercise bike rather than doing a bunch of hardcore drills, I think that's the right way to go about it. But you also want Braden Huff to get familiarity with a roster that has virtually nobody around him that he has played with. Davis Fogel is the only player that on this roster that Braden Huff played with. And let's remember, most of Fogel's playing time last year came after Huff's injury. And when Fogel played in the beginning of the year, he was playing mostly in garbage time. These two guys didn't play a lot of minutes together last year. And now he's the only teammate he can look across and see, yeah, I played in games with you, because he did not play in games with Parker Jefferson. And the team does not have Mario Saint-Superi or any of the seniors or anybody else from last year's team. So you want Huff to get that comfortability with his new teammates. Now, granted, it's August 16th as I'm recording this, and Gonzaga's starting point guard probably is not on the roster right now. So it's not like Huff has missed a bunch of opportunities to play with, whether it's a Xaivian Lee or Donovan Dent or somebody else, because they haven't been on the roster. Once that player is signed and brought in and starts practicing with the team, I think Huff will then start to be ramping up some of his activities, because you want him to get used to playing with whomever the starting point guard is, as well as with Javon Bennett, as well as with Masamba Diop. I think it's important for those two guys to get used to what each other likes to do. I think with EK and Huff, they were back. Huff was EK's backup for 2 years. And so they didn't actually play a ton of minutes together. They at least got reps in practice and got familiar with that. But once they started actually playing together, you could tell that familiarity was something that was already there for them. Huff and Diop don't have that. So you want to get used to, hey, if I'm setting the screen, I'm going to try to do a short roll. Whereas, you might try to run all the way to the basket. What does that mean for my positioning? Hey, if I have the ball at the top of the key and want to make an entry pass, do you prefer that over the top? Do you want to catch with your left hand? Whatever it may be. Those are things that you want to get used to with the other big man on the floor. And then, of course, you also want to get used to Chauncey Wiggins and comfortability with him, and Isaiah Harwell and Skylar Wicks and everybody else who ends up playing rotation minutes on this Gonzaga roster this upcoming season. So it's important for Huff to get those reps, but not at the expense of pushing him too hard in June or July or August and risking him not being able to be fully healthy for the start of what could and should potentially be an All-American caliber season for the big man. Remember, last year he averaged 17.8 points, 5.5 boards, shot nearly 70% on twos and 33% from three. He was Gonzaga's leading scorer when he went down with that injury in mid-January. Graham Ike basically shouldered the entire load for this team the rest of the year and ended up averaging about 20 points per game en route to third-team All-American honors. Huff, this roster is tailor-made for Huff to be an All-American, especially if they get a pass-first point guard like Lee or Dent. They can navigate the pick and roll. They can get Huff that ball in the short roll. They can get him the ball down on the block. Diop helps erase mistakes defensively, which takes some pressure off of Huff on that end of the floor. Chauncey Wiggins spaces the floor and will pull a big defender away from the rim, which gives Huff more room to operate. Harwell's a good defensive guard, which should help Huff as well. Fogel's a great slasher, somebody who, again, takes some gravity away from Huff and gives him more room to operate. Like, he is in a incredible position to be a 20-point per game, super efficient, low post monster this upcoming season. And the fact that he is healthy and that the staff is being extra cautious with him further emphasizes the point that he could be in line for a all-time great season in Gonzaga basketball history. Well, if you discuss some of those eligibility issues with the Europeans, including Izan Almanza, who's a big part of Gonzaga's front court, we're going to talk about what this means for Almanza, as well as French point guard Nathan de Sousa, coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, if you've got a sweet tooth, you know how tough it is to find that perfect treat that doesn't have all the sugar. And that's why Cotton Candy 5-Hour Energy Shot brings that nostalgic flavor back in a whole new way. This is that classic cotton candy taste that you remember, but with a tasty caffeine boost and zero sugar. It's such a quick and easy way to satisfy that sweet craving while keeping things simple and on the go. I've always loved cotton candy. Who hasn't? Especially people who are into sports. We love going to sporting events, having some cotton candy, but we can't be eating sweets all day. This is the perfect alternative. The flavor really does bring that throwback fruity vanilla vibe, and it's surprisingly smooth. I also like how convenient it is too. It's just a small little portable shot you can grab wherever and have as a little pick-me-up. It's become my go-to when I want something sweet without going overboard. So bring that sweetness with cotton candy 5-hour energy shots, available online now at 5hourenergy.com or on Amazon. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking about what Mark Few said over Hall of Fame weekend in Massachusetts, getting inducted in the class of 2026 alongside NBA head coach Doc Rivers, former Phoenix Suns and New York Knicks forward Amari Stoudemire. Mike D'Antoni went in as a contributor, and then a trio of WNBA superstars, Candace Parker, Chamique Holtzclaw, and Elena Deladon, all going in as well. Again, Few's great speech, talked about growing up in Crestwell, Oregon, town of 1,500 people, one stoplight. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but basically said, people asked if this is what I dreamed of, and I came from a town so small I couldn't even dream of this. And I thought it was a lovely way to start his speech. And again, just some fantastic stuff from him. But a lot of what he talked about, especially on Friday during the media availability, was about this upcoming season and some of the challenges that we've seen him and his staff face this offseason. So that's kind of what I want to get into here. He was asked about kind of just the offseason in general and some of the eligibility concerns. And he did talk more about 5-5, and we are going to get to that to close out the show. But I wanted to read a part of a quote again that he said that was reported by Theo Lawson of the Spokesman Review about the crazy offseason and, again, European eligibility specifically. Here's the quote here. Quote, "It's been frustrating, but it's just different in this day and age. We've had several of the European kids that the NCAA's kind of acted like they're going to change how they interpret these, and they did it when you're already through your recruiting cycle, which has just been crazy." Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a second. Continuing, Few said, quote, "We voiced our concerns. All of us coaches have. We don't know what's going to happen with how they rule Europeans, even though they were letting everyone in last year. Now the fifth-year thing has happened, and honestly, I think there's some real opportunities there for us to enhance our roster and solidify it. So we're working on that." So obviously we know the fifth-year stuff. They've already added Chauncey Wiggins from Florida State. They've already added Javon Bennett from Dayton. He says, we're working on that. We know that the working on that is conversations with Xaivian Lee and Donovan Dent, perhaps some other guard options as well, and perhaps some kind of insurance options for Almanza or potentially for Sousa, because Few seems a little concerned about the eligibility here for those two guys. He didn't mention them by name, nor can he or should he in this situation, but that's pretty obviously what is being talked about here. And Few's absolutely right. The NCAA has acted like they're going to change how they interpret these rules. They had that kind of release that came out in May that basically said, if you played in a league that pays higher than kind of basically normal goods and services type pay, if you played in a league that pays a higher minimum salary than that, then we're going to challenge that eligibility, is basically what the NCAA said. And then they kind of said, oh, this is just our normal rules. And it's like, last year, this wasn't the ruling at all. Everybody who wanted to play last year got to play from Europe. Like they were stingier on G League and stingier on other spots. But if you played in Europe, you pretty much were allowed to play college basketball last year. You look at guys like Luka Bogovac for North Carolina, Tez DeRader from Virginia. You look at, again, many other ones who came in. Ivan Karchenkov at Arizona. He was a 21-year-old from Germany. Obviously, Gonzaga landed Saint-Superi last year. Like, there was international guys just flying in from all over the place last season. And then this year, while teams were actively recruiting and after teams had already landed players, was when the NCAA kind of starts to say, hey, we're actually going to be a lot stricter on this, which is just ridiculous from a timing perspective. And that's what Few alluded to here, is like, it's just been crazy. And he said, again, we voiced our concerns. All of us coaches have. He has spoken to the NCAA about the timing of this kind of decision to seemingly arbitrarily crack down on internationals. And the thing is, I don't think it's a bad thing to maybe better police which players come over internationally. With college basketball now having an influx of significant life-changing money being paid out to student athletes, you are going to have European pros choose to leave their clubs and come play in the United States. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think it needs to be monitored. It needs to be monitored because this should not just be a stopgap for professionals. It should be a place where college-age kids come to play college basketball and also, go to classes and get at least part of an education. Like, that is what college athletics should still be. And again, the 5-and-5 rules are going to help with that. You're not going to get, if you get a 22-year-old coming over, they're only going to have eligibility for 1 year. And I think that's fine. But the NCAA's decision to seemingly out of nowhere decide we're going to crack down hard on guys who played in certain leagues at certain levels without having previously indicated their plan to do that is BS. That's not what Few said. That's what I'm going to say, because I think that's what Few meant. It's ridiculous just to have this come out randomly in May or June when teams have already built huge amounts of rosters, and to do it when the NCAA knew. They knew that 5-and-5 was going to go into it. They knew this in May. They knew this in June, that 5-and-5 was going to be likely go into effect. They hadn't finalized the vote, but they knew it was going to pass. They knew they were going to get the numbers to be able to pass 5-and-5. And they knew that they weren't planning to grandfather in the class of 2022. So they created an even bigger, let's say, crap storm by having all these international guys in eligibility limbo, like Almanza, like Sousa. Again, many other teams have guys who are currently sitting in eligibility limbo. So they have these teams with rosters that are not finalized and that cannot be finalized because they are very slowly going through all of these international eligibility requirements, while then creating a situation where a whole bunch of players became effectively free agents, which again, they didn't want that to happen, but they knew that it was going to happen. They knew that lawsuits were going to be filed on behalf of the class of 2022, and they probably knew that judges were going to grant those TROs and give those student athletes eligibility. So to further complicate your own mess by putting teams in a position where they have guys who are committed to their roster, their program, but who are not eligible yet, is a nightmare. That the end of completely of the NCAA's own doing. And again, I've said this on the show a couple of times. I think it is by design. I know that I'm paraphrasing the exact actual phrase, but basically there's the idea that don't attribute like malice when ineffectiveness or just basically stupidity is the more likely option. Don't assume somebody is being evil or doing something like intentionally wrong when they might just be not very smart. I can understand that concept here, but I don't think the NCAA is so inept that they couldn't foresee a situation where teams would be going after fifth-year guys, potentially filling holes on their roster that are only there because they're waiting for eligibility from international guys. There is no possible way they did not determine that this could happen. It is just a feature, not a bug for them right now, because they want chaos, because they're hoping that Congress will do something for them, which was a bad bet, as we have seen with the Protect College Sports Act getting pushed till after the recess. What a mess of a situation here, again, created entirely by the NCAA's own undoing. Izan Almanza and Nathan Sousa are the two players impacted by Gonzaga right now, both committed to the program, both committed a long time ago for what it's worth. Sousa is 23 years old. By the new 5-and-5 rules, he should have 1 season of college basketball eligibility remaining. He has played professionally in the Betclic Elite League in France. I don't know if the NCAA is going to determine a player from that league is ineligible or not. It seems unlikely. I'm surprised Sousa's eligibility hasn't been cleared up yet, but now I'm also not sure if he's going to arrive on campus. If I was Nathan Sousa and I got my eligibility cleared and Gonzaga also landed Xaivian Lee or Donovan Dent, and they have, let's say, Lee and Javon Bennett playing point guard, I don't think I'd spend the 1 year I get an opportunity to play college basketball as a third string point guard. I also don't know if the money that Gonzaga promised to Sousa is still going to be there if they're having to pay a point guard as well as Wiggins and Bennett. So I'm not sure. If Gonzaga does land their top tier point guard, I wouldn't be shocked if Nathan Sousa doesn't end up being a Zag this upcoming season. The Zags really want Izan Almanza, I'll tell you that. 21-year-old big man from Real Madrid, played for the G League Ignite, played for the Perth Wildcats in the NBL. Last year played for Real Madrid, again in Liga Endesa in Spain. Really good rebounder, really good third big on this roster alongside Diop and Huff. But his eligibility is a big question mark. I think based on Few's frustration here that they're having a hard time being able to convince the NCAA that Almanza should be eligible. I don't know for sure. I don't know if he's already had waivers denied and they're in the appeal process. That's what happened last year with Grant Foster. If the NCAA just hasn't gotten back to them yet, I don't know what the situation is there, but I'm wondering if Gonzaga is starting to peruse the fifth-year senior market for a third-string big man that could come in case Almanza doesn't get eligible. The Zags could rely on Parker Jefferson or Sam Funches or some combination of both. Obviously, Chauncey Wiggins can play some small ball 4 as well, but I suspect the staff is really hoping Almanza gets that eligibility, but if he does not, they may have another trick up their sleeve to try to finish out the roster. Either way, all of this, the fact that the Zags have these contingency plans and are trying to figure out who exactly is going to be on the roster, who might not, who they should try to go after, who's eligible, all of this was the NCAA's own doing, and Few was restrained in what he had to say about it, but also quite clear in hey, we talked to the NCAA about this, we have voiced our concerns, and this is still the situation we found ourselves in. And that's a lot of what Few had to say about 5-5 as well. And that's what we're going to get to close out the show. He's unbothered bringing in these players, even as coaches like Dan Hurley and others kind of lambast it to the media. Mark Few doesn't care. He's going to tell you exactly why coming up to close out the show in just a second. But first, folks, baseball fans, if you think you know who's hitting a home run today, FanDuel's giving you a free chance to call your shot with daily dingers. It's easy to play. You just make your free pick for who you think is going to hit a home run in their game that day. And if you are right, you'll receive a profit boost to use on your next bet for a chance at extra winnings. And best of all, you can make a free pick every single day for the rest of the MLB season. Daily Dingers is another fun way to stay engaged with every day's games, whether you're following your favorite team, whether you're keeping an eye on matchups, whether you're following your fantasy team. Every game has someone capable of going deep, and now you get a chance to make that prediction before first pitch. One of my favorite parts of baseball is that every day brings fresh matchups and new storylines. We're getting down towards the doldrums of the summer, the heating up here before the playoff push. Daily Dingers gives you another reason to pay attention before that first pitch. Looking at national championship odds, Gonzaga is at plus 3,000 to win it all. If you want to get in before they make a roster addition that might change those odds, now's the time to do it. Join all the action at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com to play Daily Dingers and make your free pick on who's hitting a home run. Play ball and swing for the fences on FanDuel, an official partner of MLB. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags. Closing out the show, continuing our conversation, reacting to some of the comments Mark Few made ahead of his induction ceremony into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame on Saturday in Massachusetts. Again, these quotes were part of his media availability on Friday, pulled most of these quotes from Theo Lawson of the Spokesman Review. I know Andrew Quinn from Krem was there as well, a handful of other reporters doing some great work on the ground, getting to go out to Massachusetts to cover this event. We talked about Mark Few's comments about Braden Huff's knee injury, very positive update on how Huff has been doing. Also talked about Mark Few's comments about kind of just the chaos of the offseason in general, specifically some conversation about the frustration around the European eligibility and the amount of time that it has taken for eligibility battles with Izan Almanza and Nathan D'Souza. Again, Few did not name either of those players individually because he probably cannot while they're going through that process, but we know that those are the two players Gonzaga has been working through to try to get eligible for this upcoming season. We also know that both those players have had players kind of join the team that sort of are replacing them or at least taking some of their minutes. Those are both players coming from the 5-5 eligibility in Javon, Bennett and Chauncey Wiggins. Few was asked very specifically about the 5-5 ruling. Again, this is just a part of a longer quote to what he said, but I want to react to this here. For those who haven't seen, Dan Hurley and a couple other coaches, I think Rick Pitino said some things and Tom Izzo said some things basically of like that coaches shouldn't be going after these kind of players and like it's an integrity thing and blah, blah, blah. And Few didn't respond to that directly necessarily, but shared his thoughts on 5-5 players. And this is what he said, quote, "Listen, if the courts are going to rule them eligible and they're eligible, I don't know why anybody would ever say anything about them. I think many people have spoke about how that particular class is the only one that hasn't had this. Moving forward, they're going to have it. And behind them was COVID. It's one class. So you're like, yeah, they're right. Then behind the scenes, some of us coaches told the NCAA over and over again, if they waited longer to announce this, they probably wouldn't have this issue. So I don't know why anybody would not be open to it. Maybe you don't need it, but if you do, these are good guys. The kids we're recruiting graduated from college. They're going to our school, and they're great people, great assets to our program. I don't know why you wouldn't do that. Bravo, Coach Few. Agree on all accounts here. I highlighted in bold the part where he said, some of us coaches told the NCAA over and over again, if they waited longer to announce this, they probably wouldn't have this issue. That has been something that has been rattling around in my brain for a while. Because again, it goes back to the conversation we just had, the conversation I've had a couple of times on the show about the idea of the NCAA just being this bumbling, like outrageously unintelligent group that can't seem to foresee anything that's going to happen, versus the NCAA willingly making decisions that are going to create added chaos for coaches and players and administrators and fans and everybody, because they are hoping it will push towards Congress making a decision. If a group of coaches and presumably other folks repeatedly told the NCAA not only, hey, this is a bad idea, or hey, excluding this class is a bad idea, because if people are telling you, hey, I disagree with the decision you're making, and they're just saying, fine, I don't care that you disagree, we're going to do it anyway, that's one thing. But they were being specifically advised on a way to handle this situation that would create less chaos. And I'm having a really hard time seeing a counter argument from the NCAA as to why it was better to announce it in July or June, when they knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was going to prompt lawsuits to get players eligible for this upcoming season. If they announced this in November or December, okay, starting with the 27-28 academic school year, the 5-and-5 rules are going to go into effect. This is what it means for current student athletes. This is what it means for future student athletes. It goes into effect starting right now for every class going forward. If they'd announced that in December, yes, it's possible a handful of student athletes would have fired up some lawsuits to try to get eligible for the second half of the season. We saw it with Charles Bediako last year. We saw it with the kid at Baylor, James Najee. It is possible that there would have been some legal moves to try to get some of those class of 2022 guys a half semester of eligibility. And there would have been a lot of really pissed off seniors from that class who watched the NCAA sabotage their chances of playing a fifth year in college basketball. And I don't blame them for being pissed had this happened. But the NCAA isn't making a different decision announcing this in November, December versus announcing it in June. In June, by announcing it then, they actually gave these kids an opportunity to play, which is seemingly the last thing that they wanted. And yet their decision on the timing clearly allowed that to happen. And that's why I'm having a hard time thinking the NCAA is just incompetent. They could have released this information in November, December. They could have avoided all of these lawsuits, or the vast majority of these lawsuits. They were directly advised by people involved in the sport, including, pretty important voices like Coach Fuse. They were advised to do that, and they chose not to. Having a hard time finding a specific reason other than wanting the chaos for why the NCAA would do this. And I don't think this is particularly conspiratorial or anything like that. I think it is it's kind of just laid out right in front of us that the NCAA, they said, oh, we spoke with student athletes, we spoke with these advisory committees and determined to exclude the class of 2022. I believe that that's true to some extent. But again, it's not about whether they had those conversations and all of that. It's about understanding what's going to happen, understanding the ramifications of the decision that you make. Maybe they were as arrogant as they seem in believing that not a single one of these cases would be ruled in favor of the plaintiffs where the student athletes would get eligibility, in which case they are incredibly stupid, because it was pretty clear the NCAA was going to lose these court cases, and they have gotten shredded up to this point in a court of law. Very, very baffling to see how this has played out. The rest of Few's quote, I thought it was great. I think it summarizes accurately how I feel about this. They're eligible. The courts have determined they're eligible. The NCAA hasn't really won on fighting back on that. Again, he didn't necessarily connect directly with the European, but I think that's part of it, of like, hey, we're having guys that the NCAA does control their eligibility and is just kind of holding on to that information. So we're going to go after the guys that they don't control eligibility around in Wiggins and Bennett. And I don't blame them for that. And this is not some nefarious thing. Few is just trying to build the best roster he possibly can to compete for a national championship. And Chauncey Wiggins and Javon Bennett add to that in a major way. Izan Almanza would add to that in a major way as well if he gets eligible. So would Nathan Sousa if he wants to show up and be a third string point guard. But again, Gonzaga is going after Xaivian Lee and Donovan Dent because if that California lawsuit gets ruled on in favor of the plaintiffs, those guys will be eligible. And that makes your team better. They're eligible players. They're good kids. They're going to grad school. Like, there's nothing wrong with bringing these players in. I'll admit that Gonzaga is in a different situation. Some coaches are mad at the teams that they felt like just kind of had a bad offseason or like didn't do much this offseason and are now just kind of being able to reap the rewards. And I understand that. I understand being pissed off at LSU and Will Wade. They have 4 players on their roster, legitimately 4 players on their roster until they added Sky Clark over the weekend. Now they have 5. I'm also judging Sky Clark a little bit. You don't go to a roster with only 4 players on it unless you're pretty motivated by money and not a whole lot else. But hey, to each their own. I don't hate on doing that. But if you're mad at Will Wade for now being able to build a roster because he didn't do anything over the offseason, fine. Gonzaga got screwed by Jack Cahill, screwed by Mario Saint-Superi. It put them in a bind position. They also have the 2 outstanding eligibility concerns, both players that I think should be eligible, but that the NCAA may prevent from being eligible. And they have capitalized on those things that were outside of their control by adding 5th-year seniors. So it goes. It's, it is what it is. In this case, you have to go with the cards you've been dealt. They were dealt a bad hand with Cahill and Saint-Superi. They were dealt a bad hand with the NCAA arbitrarily deciding to tighten up on European eligibility. They were dealt a really good hand with 5-5 becoming an option for them. They're taking advantage of it. I don't see anything wrong with that. Obviously, we're going to have much more about this conversation. We're going to talk more about 5-5, of course, more on Xaivian Lee and Donovan Dent as the Zags continue their pursuit of another point guard, and of course, more on Almanza and Sousa as we get more word on their eligibility status, hopefully in the coming days or weeks here on Locked On Zags. That's going to wrap it up for me today, folks, here on the podcast. I want to thank all of you so much for making the show your first listen or watch of the day. We'll be back with more fun stuff later this week. Until then, though, folks, as always, go Zags.